There is a moment in history so astonishing, so far outside the boundaries of what most of us could ever imagine doing ourselves, that it almost doesn't feel real. It feels like something invented, something fabricated for a film, or stretched into legend over generations of retelling. But it happened. It was real. And the man at the center of it was not a superhero, not a myth, not a figure untethered from ordinary human life. He was a farmer. He wrote poetry. He painted pictures. He had a wife and two young children, and land he had inherited from his family, and he kissed them all goodbye one September morning in 1940 and walked out into the street to get himself arrested by the Nazis. Not because he had been caught, not because someone had betrayed him, not because he had no choice. He walked into the roundup voluntarily. He wanted to be captured. He had a plan, and the plan required him to go somewhere that most people, upon learning the name of it, would sprint in the opposite direction at full speed. His destination was Auschwitz, and what he chose to do, once he was inside, is one of the most remarkable stories to come out of the entire Second World War. His name was Witold Pilecki. He was a cavalry officer, a resistance fighter, and the only person in recorded history who is known to have voluntarily entered Auschwitz as a prisoner. He spent nearly 1,000 days behind its walls, enduring the starvation, the beatings, the disease, the constant proximity of death, and all the while he was building something, a network, a living organism of resistance growing quietly and invisibly through the most brutal extermination system in human history. Yet he was smuggling intelligence to the outside world, intelligence that would become the first comprehensive Allied account of what the Nazis were actually doing inside Auschwitz. And the world, for a long time, didn't want to believe it. This is his story. A family born into resistance. To understand Witold Pilecki, you first have to understand the family he came from, because the family tells you everything. The Pileckis were not passive people. They were not the kind of family that quietly accepted the shape of the world around them. They pushed back. They always had. Witold was born on the 13th of May, 1901, in a small town called Olonets, deep in the Karelian region of what was then the Russian Empire. That's about 700 miles from the Polish homeland his family still considered their own. The Pileckis weren't in Russia by choice. They were there because of what Witold's grandfather, Józef Pilecki, had done. Józef had participated in the January uprising of 1863 and 1864, and the Polish insurrection against Russian rule that had been brutally crushed by Tsar Alexander. As punishment, the family's lands were confiscated, and Józef was exiled to the Russian interior. From that moment on, the Pileckis lived as a Polish family stranded in a Russian sea, surrounded by a language and a culture that wasn't theirs, holding on to their identity with the grip of people who had already learned what it cost to lose it. Witold's father, Julian, got an education at the Forest Institute in St. Petersburg and found work as a forest inspector in Karelia. It was a good job in a faraway place, and the family lived there. But Witold's mother, Ludwika, was fiercely determined that her children would not become Russian. She made sure they spoke Polish at home. She told them stories about the January uprising, about the executions carried out under the Russian governor Muravyov, the man Poles nicknamed the Hangman, and she gave her children something the Russian Empire could not confiscate, a sense of who they were and where they belonged. As a boy, Witold moved between Karelia, Vilnius, and other towns as the family followed the shifting currents of Ludwika's attempts to keep the children close to their Polish heritage. During the First World War, as a teenager in the Russian city of Oriol, he formed a scouting group and became involved with a secret Polish military organization preparing men to serve in a future Polish army. In 1918, he led his young scouts on a raid of German military barracks to acquire uniforms and equipment. Nobody died. It worked, and Witold Pilecki was 17 years old. By the time he was 19, he was fighting in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921, the conflict that erupted as the newly reconstituted Polish state battled Bolshevik forces over the territory of present-day Ukraine and Belarus. Pilecki served in a cavalry unit and fought with enough distinction to be awarded the Cross of Valor twice. He was young, he was tough, he had a soldier's training and a patriot's conviction, and when the war ended in 1921 with a Polish victory, he came home to something his family had been waiting decades to have: a free Poland. The years that followed were the quiet years, good years. He took over the family estate near Lida, a town that was then in eastern Poland and is now part of modern Belarus. In 1931, he married Maria Ostrowska, an elementary school teacher. They had 2 children together, a son named Andrzej and a daughter named Zofia. Pilecki farmed his land, managed his estate, and in his spare time he painted and wrote poetry. He was, by most outward measures, a country gentleman living a peaceful life. He helped establish a local fire department. His neighbors knew him as a dependable, community-minded man. And he seemed to have put the wars behind him. But Poland in the 1930s was not a country at rest. Nazi Germany was rising to the west. Soviet power was consolidating to the east. And the country, sitting between these two forces, had very little room for comfort. Pilecki remained a reserve officer in the Polish military, keeping his training current, and when the storm finally broke in September of 1939, he was ready. The Making of a Soldier and the Fall of Poland. On the 1st of September, 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west. 16 days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, in accordance with the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that the two powers had signed in August. Poland, caught between the two largest military machines on the continent, was overwhelmed in just over a month. On the 27th of September, Warsaw surrendered. Pilecki was already fighting before the surrender. He had mobilized a reserve unit of local men that summer, men he had been training for exactly this scenario. Jack Fairweather, in his book about Pilecki called The Volunteer, describes most of these men as peasants who had never seen action or fired a gun in anger. Pilecki did what he could with them. When Poland's organized military resistance crumbled, his unit dissolved along with the rest, some men surrendering, others going into hiding or scattering across the countryside. Pilecki went to Warsaw. He didn't stay home. He didn't try to wait out the occupation. He made his way to the capital and plunged into the already forming underground resistance, where he found other veterans and patriots who had reached the same conclusion he had: that occupation did not mean surrender, and that the fight had simply changed in form. In early November 1939, just weeks after the fall of Warsaw, Pilecki and his commanding officer, Major Jan Włodarkiewicz, co-founded a new organization called the Tajna Armia Polska, which translates as the Secret Polish Army. Within roughly a year, the organization had grown to more than 8,000 members. It was later folded into a broader underground structure that became the Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, which would go on to be one of the largest resistance organizations in occupied Europe, eventually numbering up to 500,000 soldiers. Pilecki was the kind of resistance officer who didn't just want to survive the occupation. He wanted to act. And in the summer of 1940, something happened that gave him an idea so audacious it barely seemed like a real plan at all. In August of 1940, a group of Polish political prisoners who had been transported to a new German camp near the town of Auschwitz in southern Poland simply disappeared. Telegrams arrived at their families' homes, informing them of deaths that offered no explanation, no details, no clarity. And the Polish underground was alarmed. What was this camp? What was happening inside it? The camp was called Auschwitz. Very little was known about it from the outside. It had opened formally in May 1940, initially to house Polish political prisoners, and it bore a reputation for brutality. But its full nature remained opaque. Someone needed to go inside and find out. Someone needed to be there, embedded within it, gathering information that could be smuggled out to the resistance in Warsaw, and from there to the Polish government in exile in London. Major Włodarkiewicz looked at his officers and named the person he thought was best suited for the job. He looked at Pilecki, a plan no one else would dare. It needs to be said clearly, this was not an order. Włodarkiewicz presented it as a volunteer mission. Nobody could be commanded to walk into Auschwitz. The man who did it had to choose it himself, fully understanding what it meant. Pilecki later described his agreement to go as something that felt inevitable, something driven by patriotism and by the simple fact that someone had to do it, and he was capable of doing it. Some historians have noted there may have been a degree of political pressure, that Pilecki's refusal to swear an oath to Włodarkiewicz's ideological manifesto earlier that summer may have cast a shadow over the invitation, making it feel less optional than it was formally presented. But regardless of the precise texture of that moment, Pilecki agreed, and having agreed, he prepared. He was given false identity papers in the name of Tomasz Serafiński, a real person who had been mistakenly assumed to be dead. The cover story was simple. Pilecki was a tanner by trade, a private citizen, a man with no military connection, no underground affiliation, a nothing to hide. His real name, his real rank, his real purpose would remain entirely unknown to his captors. He would be just another arrested Pole among thousands. On the 19th of September, 1940, Witold Pilecki kissed his wife Maria and his two young children goodbye, walked out of his sister-in-law's apartment in the Żoliborz neighborhood of Warsaw, and entered the path of a German roundup that was sweeping through the area. These street sweeps were called łapanki, mass arrests of civilians conducted by German security forces as a tool of terror, a way of pulling in people to be sent to camps or forced labor. Pilecki joined the crowd of people being herded together. He had a safe hiding place available to him. He didn't use it. He let himself be caught. Approximately 2,000 Polish civilians were arrested that day. They were held for 2 days in an old cavalry barracks in Warsaw, where the guards beat them with rubber truncheons. And then they were loaded onto freight trains and shipped south. On the night of the 21st to the 22nd of September, 1940, the train arrived at Auschwitz. Witold Pilecki, farmer, poet, father, cavalry officer, and resistance volunteer, climbed down from the train and walked through the gates of one of the most lethal places on earth. He later wrote that he felt as though he was entering somewhere that was no longer of this world. He bade farewell, he said, to everything he had hitherto known on this earth. The guards processed the new arrivals with characteristic violence. Pilecki's head was shaved. He was given a striped prisoner's uniform and a pair of ill-fitting wooden shoes. A guard knocked out 2 of his front teeth when he failed to hold his prisoner identification sign correctly. He was tattooed with a number. That number was 4,859. From this point forward to his captors, he was not Tomasz Serafiński, and he was certainly not Witold Pilecki. He was 4,859, and he had work to do. A prisoner 4859. Life inside Auschwitz. What Pilecki found inside Auschwitz was even worse than the underground had feared. The camp was organized as a machine for the systematic destruction of human beings. Not yet the full industrial extermination complex it would become, but already a place where men died in enormous numbers from starvation, beatings, disease, and outright murder. New arrivals were told by the guards with matter-of-fact cruelty that the only way out of Auschwitz was through the chimney. The daily caloric ration for prisoners amounted to approximately 300 to 700 calories, a bowl of thin, watery soup, and a small ration of bread. Men wasted away within weeks of arriving. Lice infestations were constant and severe. Bedbugs plagued the overcrowded sleeping blocks. Typhus moved through the camp in waves, killing hundreds at a time. The physical labor assigned to prisoners, hauling rocks, clearing land, carrying heavy materials across the campgrounds, was designed to break the body and exhaust the spirit simultaneously. Punishments were administered with breathtaking randomness and savagery. A guard could beat a prisoner to death for any reason or no reason at all. On Pilecki's first day in the camp, he watched as every man in a transport was shot upon arrival. He saw a former judge beaten to death in front of him. He himself had teeth knocked out within hours of walking through the gate. The men who wielded day-to-day power over the prisoners were called kapos, prisoner functionaries, often German or Polish criminals, who wore yellow armbands and managed the labor commandos. Many were violent sadists who had been given free rein over defenseless people and exercised that power in the worst ways imaginable. To cross a capo was to risk immediate and severe violence. To draw the attention of the SS guards was potentially fatal, and the entire environment was designed to strip away identity, dignity, and the will to resist. Pilecki survived bouts of pneumonia and typhus. He lived on the same starvation rations as everyone else. He hauled rocks and stood for hours in the freezing cold during roll calls that could stretch on interminably while guards walked the lines, pulling men out for arbitrary punishment. In his later writing, he described hunger as the hardest battle of his life. He was overwhelmed at times by the sheer scale of what he was witnessing, but he refused to let it show. If his colleagues in the resistance network saw him falter, it could damage their morale. So he bore it quietly and kept working. What gave Pilecki the capacity to endure all of this, where other men collapsed or abandoned hope, was purpose. While everyone around him was simply trying to survive, Pilecki had something nobody else had, a reason for being there that went beyond survival. He had chosen to come. He had a mission, and that mission began almost the moment he arrived. Building the underground, the ZOW. Within weeks of his arrival, Pilecki began recruiting. He had to do this with extraordinary care. One wrong approach, one misread person, one informer planted by the camp Gestapo, and he was dead. Not just dead himself, but potentially taking everyone he had already recruited down with him. So he moved slowly and carefully. He started with men he already knew from the Polish underground. When the first transports arrived from Warsaw in those early months, some of them contained members of the Tajna Armia Polska. Pilecki identified familiar faces, made contact, established trust, and began building. The organization he created inside Auschwitz was called the Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, the Union of Military Organization, or WWII. It was structured deliberately in small cells of roughly 5 members each. No single member of the network knew the identities of more than a handful of others. This compartmentalization was essential. If the Gestapo caught one ZWW member and interrogated him, meaning tortured him, the damage he could cause to the wider network was limited by the simple fact that he didn't know much. The information couldn't be extracted because it had never been passed along. The goals of ZOW were layered and ambitious. On the surface level, the most immediate work was basic human solidarity, smuggling extra food into the camp, distributing clothing, sharing medicine where it could be obtained. in a place defined by calculated deprivation, even a small additional piece of bread could keep a man alive another day. ZOE members shared what they had and looked out for each other. On a second level, ZOE functioned as an intelligence-gathering machine. Members were spread across different labor commandos throughout the camp, the bakery, the construction details, the hospital, the administration offices. Each position gave access to different kinds of information: the layout of the camp, the locations of weapons and ammunition stores, the numbers of SS guards and their patrol patterns, the names and numbers of new arrivals, the death tolls, the methods being used to kill prisoners. All of this was fed back to Pilecki through the cell structure, compiled, and prepared for transmission out of the camp. On a third level, ZOE was preparing for something more dramatic, a potential armed uprising. Pilecki, from the very beginning, was thinking about not just reporting on Auschwitz, but actually doing something about it. He envisioned a scenario where ZW, if it could grow large enough and receive weapons and support from the outside, might be able to seize control of the camp long enough for Allied forces or the Home Army to arrive and liberate the prisoners. This was, in the context of what we now know about the scale of German military force in the region, an extraordinarily difficult proposition. But Pilecki never stopped pushing for it. One of the most extraordinary achievements of the ZUDW inside Auschwitz was the construction of a secret radio transmitter. Over the course of 7 months, Pilecki's men smuggled individual components into the camp piece by piece, sourcing parts from different locations across the facility, hiding them in places the guards would never think to look. When the transmitter was finally assembled, it began broadcasting intelligence from inside Auschwitz: the number of arrivals, the death tolls, the conditions, the evidence of mass killings, directly to receiving stations connected to the Polish resistance. The transmitter operated until the autumn of 1942, when Pilecki's men dismantled it after concluding that one loose-lipped member was putting the whole operation at risk of discovery. By late 1942, ZUW had grown to encompass nearly 1,000 members inside the camp, drawing in not just Polish political prisoners, but people from across the diverse population that Auschwitz was increasingly consuming. Over time, many smaller underground organizations that had independently formed within the camp merged with ZUW under Pilecki's leadership. The organization had become something genuine and substantial, a functioning underground military structure operating in one of the most surveilled and dangerous environments on Earth. Getting the word out, reports, couriers, and a world reluctant to listen. From October 1940, barely a month after his arrival, Pilecki began getting his intelligence out of the camp. The first method was elegant in its simplicity. A small number of prisoners in the early days of Auschwitz were released. Usually, those whose families had managed to pay sufficiently large bribes to the right people. These lucky few were subjected to processing that attempted to hide the physical evidence of what they had been through: the starvation, the beatings, the disease, and they were warned in the most direct terms that they would be sent back to Auschwitz along with their families if they spoke about what they had seen. Most of them kept silent. But Pilecki identified the ones who could be trusted, and he had them memorize intelligence or carry it written on scraps of paper hidden in clothing to deliver to the resistance in Warsaw. The first report was delivered in October 1940 by a young Polish officer named Aleksander Wielopolski, who had secured his release and memorized Pilecki's initial account of conditions in the camp. It described the beatings, the starvation rations, the systematic brutality, and the camp's physical layout, including the locations of warehouses and potential weapons stores. It was among the very first reliable intelligence the outside world had received about what Auschwitz actually was. From there, the reports kept coming. They were carried out by released prisoners, by men who managed to escape, by civilian workers who moved between the camp and the outside world, and could be persuaded or trusted to act as couriers. They moved from Auschwitz to the Home Army headquarters in Warsaw, and from Warsaw they were forwarded to the Polish government in exile in London, and from London they were passed to the British government and to the other Allied powers. By March 1941, Pilecki's reports had reached London via Stockholm. What the reports described grew increasingly horrific as the months passed and Auschwitz evolved. In June 1942, one of the most audacious couriering operations in the war's history occurred when 4 Polish prisoners escaped from the camp dressed in stolen SS uniforms, driving a stolen staff car belonging to the camp commandant Rudolf Höss, straight out through the main gate. One of them, Stanisław Jaster, was a ZOW member. He was carrying a detailed report written by Pilecki. The Germans never recaptured any of them. But there was a problem that grew more acute as the reports grew more urgent, and it was a problem that haunted Pilecki for the rest of his life. The world didn't believe what he was saying, or rather, it struggled to reconcile what he was saying with anything it had known before. The reports described gas chambers, systematic killings on an industrial scale, Zyklon B crematoria, and a machine designed with the specific purpose of murdering human beings in enormous numbers. These were things that the imagination, even in a world already saturated with wartime atrocity, struggled to accommodate. Allied governments received the intelligence and largely concluded that the numbers must be exaggerated, that the reports were wartime propaganda, that the reality couldn't possibly be as bad as Pilecki's account made it seem. It was exactly as an SS guard would later tell the Italian survivor Primo Levi upon his arrival at Auschwitz in 1944, that however the war ended, the Nazis had won the war against the prisoners, because no one would be left to bear witness, and even if someone survived, the world would not believe them. The transformation of hell, Auschwitz, becomes a death factory. When Pilecki arrived at Auschwitz in September 1940, The camp's population was primarily Polish political prisoners, a Catholic clergy, intellectuals, members of the resistance. It was a place of appalling brutality, but it had not yet become what it would become. Over the 2.5 years of his imprisonment, Pilecki watched that transformation happen in front of him. In June 1941, Germany broke its non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet East. The war in the East was fought with a ferocity that went beyond even the usual standards of the Second World War. Soviet prisoners of war began arriving at Auschwitz in large numbers. They were treated with particular savagery, worked and starved to death at catastrophic rates. In the autumn of 1941, the first gassings with Zyklon B were carried out at Auschwitz, initially on groups of Soviet prisoners of war. Pilecki documented this. His reports described men packed so tightly into the gas chambers that even in death they could not fall. The words are ones that do not leave you. Then came 1942, and with it, the full implementation of the final solution. The Wannsee Conference had taken place in January of that year, coordinating the bureaucratic machinery of genocide. Construction began on Auschwitz II at Birkenau, a purpose-built expansion of the complex with purpose-built gas chambers and crematoria on a scale that made the original camp look like a preliminary sketch. Pilecki watched the construction. He documented it. He understood what it meant. His reports accurately identified the purpose of the new facilities and began describing the mass murder of Jews being transported from across occupied Europe. By the time Pilecki escaped in April 1943, the crematoria at Birkenau were still under construction. The full operational capacity of the death factory, the capacity to kill and cremate thousands of people every single day, had not yet been reached, but the direction was unmistakable. More than 1 million people would ultimately die at Auschwitz, nearly 1 million of them Jewish. Pilecki had watched the beginning of all of it and sent word out to a world that was not yet ready to hear what was coming. The Great Escape. April 1943. By early 1943, it was becoming clear to Pilecki that he needed to get out. The Gestapo's camp security unit, under SS Untersturmführer Maximilian Grabner, had significantly intensified its efforts to identify and eliminate the underground network inside the camp. ZO members were being arrested, interrogated, and killed. Men who had been important pillars of the organization were being transferred to other camps or were simply disappearing. The network was under pressure it might not be able to withstand for much longer. And Pilecki had made a decision. The intelligence he was carrying in his head, the full picture of what Auschwitz had become. He was too important to lose if he was arrested and executed. He had to get out and deliver it personally. The plan came together with characteristic ingenuity. ZOW contacts within the camp's administrative structure arranged for Pilecki to be transferred to a labor detail working at the camp bakery, located about 2 kilometers outside the main perimeter fence. 2 other ZOW members, A young man named Edward Ciesielski and another named Jan Redzai were transferred to the same detail. They worked there for weeks, learning the routines, studying the guards, and making quiet preparations. Redzai used fresh bread to make an impression of the nut on the door lock, so that a wrench could be fashioned to open it. The three men prepared civilian clothes, hiding them under their striped prisoner uniforms. They prepared powdered tobacco to scatter behind them on the ground and confuse the tracker dogs. On the night of the 26th of April, 1943, assigned to a night shift at the bakery, Pilecki, Ciesielski and Redzai made their move. They cut the telephone and alarm wires. They forced open the door. They overpowered a guard, and they ran. The camp behind them erupted. Sirens blared. The manhunt began immediately. Machine gun fire split the night as the SS guards tried to alert the main guardhouse. The three men moved through darkness and rain, heading north and then east, crossing rivers and forests, staying off roads, moving by night, and sheltering during the day. At one point, a group of German soldiers spotted Pilecki and fired at him. Several bullets passed through his clothing. One grazed him, wounding but not stopping him. They reached the village of Alwernia, where a priest helped them. They moved on to Tinieks, where local people assisted. They crossed the border of the general government territory. After several days of flight, the three exhausted men reached Nowy Wisznich near the town of Bochnia in southern Poland. There, they made contact with the Regional Home Army Command. And in a coincidence almost too strange to be real, the safe house where Pilecki rested turned out to belong to a man named Tomasz Serafiński. The actual Tomasz Serafiński, the real man whose identity Pilecki had been using as his cover name for 2.5 years. The man whose documents Pilecki had carried into the darkest place on earth was standing in front of him. Witold Pilecki had escaped Auschwitz. He was shot, exhausted, and had spent nearly 1,000 days in a place designed to kill him. He was alive, and he immediately wanted to go back, not as a prisoner, but at the head of a liberating force. The world wouldn't listen. After the escape, Pilecki reached Warsaw in August 1943 and presented his detailed report to the General Headquarters of the Home Army. He described everything: the ZOW network and its members, his direct experiences inside the camp, and the full picture of the extermination program that had been building at Auschwitz-Birkenau, including the murder of Poles, Soviet POWs, Roma and Sinti prisoners, and the mass killing of Jews arriving by transport from across Europe. He also made a direct proposal. He wanted the Home Army to organize an assault on the camp. ZOW, with nearly 1,000 members inside, could take control of the central camp for a period of time if there was a coordinated attack from outside and if the Allies could provide weapons and troops to support the operation. Pilecki believed it was possible. He believed it could save tens of thousands of lives. The Home Army Command said no. The assessment was that even if the initial attack succeeded, the Germans had thousands of troops in the surrounding region. The resistance lacked the transport capacity, the ammunition, and the safe infrastructure that rescued prisoners would need. The Soviet Red Army, despite being within striking distance, had shown no interest in a joint operation. The plan was judged militarily unworkable. The Allied leadership in London, receiving the intelligence from Pilecki's reports, still largely considered the accounts of industrialized mass murder to be exaggerated. The opportunity to strike at Auschwitz from the outside was not taken. Pilecki kept fighting. He became involved with a Home Army sabotage unit called KDWW. In August 1944, when the Warsaw Uprising erupted, the largest and most desperate act of armed resistance against the German occupation, had attended as a last effort to liberate the city before the Red Army arrived from the east, Pilecki volunteered to fight. He joined the Warszawianka Company of the Krobry 2nd Battalion, but he did so as a common private soldier, not revealing his rank. He only identified himself as an officer later, after enough of the company's commanders had been killed that they needed him to lead. The Warsaw Uprising lasted 63 days. It failed. More than 18,000 Polish fighters were killed, and somewhere around 180,000 civilians died. The Germans then systematically burned what was left of the city block by block. Pilecki was captured. Jan Redzej, the man who had escaped with him from Auschwitz just the previous year, was killed on the 5th of August, 1944. Pilecki himself was sent to the prisoner of war camp at Murnau in Bavaria. In the German POW camp, the men around him called him Daddy. He was the older man who looked after the young ones, who kept morale alive, who carried the quiet authority of someone who had already survived the unsurvivable. Yet he was liberated by American troops on the 29th of April, 1945. Free, safe, in Italy with the Polish Second Corps, under General Władysław Anders, Pilecki sat down and wrote. He compiled his Auschwitz experiences into the full document that history would come to call Witold's Report. Over 100 pages, the first comprehensive eyewitness intelligence account of the Holocaust, written by someone who had been inside it for almost 3 years. It was the most important document he had ever produced, and, having produced it, he immediately began thinking about going back to Poland again. A third mission, the impossible loyalty. The war against Germany was over, but to Witold Pilecki, Poland was still not free. The country he had fought to liberate had simply traded one occupation for another. The Soviet Red Army had liberated Poland from the Nazis in 1945, but what followed liberation was the installation of a Soviet-backed communist government with no democratic mandate, and a regime that was systematically dismantling the Home Army, arresting its leaders, and executing or imprisoning anyone connected to the Polish underground. The Yalta Conference had, in effect, assigned Poland to the Soviet sphere of influence. The Polish government in exile in London, the government Pilecki had served throughout the war, was being sidelined by the international community that had grown tired of the Polish question. Pilecki had already been through the German occupation and Auschwitz and the Warsaw Uprising. Any reasonable person would have stayed in Italy. General Anders' Polish Second Corps was still intact in Italy, and Pilecki was a valued officer within it. He had a wife and children he had barely seen in years. He could have built a new life. Instead, in late 1945, he accepted one more undercover assignment and returned to Poland. And his mission was to build an intelligence network inside Poland and report back to General Anders and the Polish government in exile on the reality of Soviet occupation, the crimes being committed, the political prisoners being taken, the nature of the new communist power structure. He entered Poland under yet another false name, Roman Jezierski. He established contacts, gathered information, and sent reports out via couriers to Italy. The intelligence he gathered was factual, meticulous, exactly the kind of work he had been doing for years. When he told his wife, in private, what the interrogations by the communist secret police had done to him, he said something that tells you everything about the scale of what he had endured and what this final imprisonment was costing him. He told her that compared to his communist captors, Auschwitz had been a trifle. The communist security apparatus had identified his network by the spring of 1947. On the 8th of May, 1947, agents of the Ministry of Public Security arrested Witold Pilecki, and he was taken to the interrogation center on Rakowiecka Street in Warsaw's Mokotów district. What followed was months of torture. Despite everything that was done to him, he did not give up the names of his contacts. He protected the people who had worked with him. He endured the interrogations as he had endured everything else. The show trial. Justice betrayed. The trial of Witold Pilecki began on the 3rd of March, 1948. It was not a trial in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a performance, a political spectacle designed to send a message to anyone in Poland who might be considering resistance to the new regime. The charges against him were numerous and largely fabricated. He was accused of working for foreign intelligence services, specifically of being a spy for British intelligence and for General Anders. He was accused of preparing armed assassinations of senior officials in the Communist Ministry of Public Security. He was accused of possessing weapons. He denied the assassination charges completely and consistently. He acknowledged that he had passed information to the Polish Second Corps in Italy, information about what the Soviet occupation was doing to Poland, but insisted that this was not espionage. It was loyal service to the Polish command he still considered legitimate. What made the trial particularly grotesque was the identity of some of those who participated in it. The prosecutor was a man who had himself been an officer of the wartime Home Army. One of the witnesses who testified against Pilecki was Józef Cyrankiewicz, a man who had been an Auschwitz survivor himself and who would go on to become Prime Minister of Communist Poland. The men sitting in judgment had shared the struggle against the Nazis. Now they were serving a different master. Pilecki wrote a letter to the communist president Bolesław Bierut from his cell, requesting clemency. The opening line was, "All my life I have worked for Poland." His wife wrote too. His lawyer wrote. Bierut pardoned two of Pilecki's co-defendants who had also received death sentences. He refused to pardon Pilecki. On the 15th of March, 1948, the verdict was announced. Death. On the 20th of May, President Bierut confirmed the sentence. On the evening of the 25th of May, 1948, at 9:30 in the evening, in the basement of Mokotów prison on Rakowiecka Street in Warsaw, Witold Pilecki was executed with a gunshot to the back of the head. The method was the same one the Soviets had used to murder tens of thousands of Poles in the Cotton Forest massacres. The executioner was a prison official who had earned himself the nickname the Butcher of Mokotów. His last recorded words were, "Long live free Poland." He was 47 years old. His body was taken away and buried in secret. To this day, despite extensive excavations carried out by Poland's Institute of National Remembrance at the area of the Powązki Cemetery, where victims of communist executions are believed to be buried, Witold Pilecki's remains have never been found. The legacy, a name recovered from silence. For more than 4 decades, the name Witold Pilecki was erased. The communist government of Poland could not acknowledge his wartime heroism without completing the story of his post-war resistance and his execution as a patriot rather than a traitor. His family was barred from higher education. His children, Andrzej and Zofia, were teenagers when their father was executed. They heard the news reports of his trial on a school radio, presented by the state as the exposure and punishment of a spy and traitor. They grew up not knowing the truth. And it was not until after the fall of communism in Poland in 1989, not until the 1990s, that they finally learned who their father had actually been. It was only in September 1990 that the Supreme Court of Poland formally acquitted Witold Pilecki of all charges and acknowledged the unjust nature of his execution. In 1995, he was awarded the Order of Polonia Restituta. In 2006, President Lech Kaczynski awarded him Poland's highest honor, the Order of the White Eagle, posthumously. In 2013, he was formally promoted to the rank of colonel. The full text of Witold's report was not published until the year 2000, 55 years after it was written, and it only appeared in English translation in 2012 under the title The Auschwitz Volunteer, Beyond Bravery. Poland's chief rabbi, Michael Szydrich, wrote in the foreword that when God created the human being, God had in mind that we should all be like Captain Witold Pilecki. And the historian Norman Davies wrote that if there was an Allied hero who deserved to be remembered and celebrated, this was a person with very few peers. Jack Fairweather's 2019 book, The Volunteer, which reconstructed Pilecki's full story from documentary sources and interviews with people who had known him, won the Costa Book Award and brought his name to a genuinely international audience for perhaps the first time. Streets in Poland are named after him. Schools carry his name. The Pilecki Institute maintains his memory and carries out research. His burial place remains unknown. What endures beyond the honors, the books, and the memorials is the simplest version of what Pilecki actually did. A man with a wife and children and a farm and a life looked at the darkness spreading across his country and decided freely to walk into the worst of it. Not because he was ordered to, not because he had no other option, because someone had to, and he was the one willing. And he spent nearly 1,000 days in a place designed to kill everyone inside it. He built something in that place. He sent the truth out to a world that didn't want to hear it, and he kept sending it anyway. He escaped and immediately wanted to go back. When his country fell under a new occupation, he went home one more time and was killed for it. He faced every version of the darkness his era could produce and did not stop. His daughter Zofia said, years after learning who her father truly was, that he had tried to live his life so that in the hour of his death he would feel joy rather than fear. There is no reason to doubt that on the night of the 25th of May, 1948, he did. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to WWII Tales so you don't miss what comes next. These are real human beings whose names and choices deserve to be known, and every like and subscription helps this channel reach more people who have never heard of them. The stories are here. Let's make sure they aren't forgotten.